Hi everyone. In this video I'm going to take you through how to create a Bootstrap carousel, also known as a slider, and we'll populate that using data from a Dataverse table. We'll query using Fetch XML, which we'll build using Advanced Find, and then we'll loop through each result, populating the background image, heading and paragraph for each slide. We'll take a quick start approach, so I'll get you a result very quickly using a snippet that I've put together for you with some of the fiddly liquid bits already in place. And then if you're interested in how to create that from scratch, stick around and we'll go through the making of that later. So I've created you a boilerplate piece of code that you can copy and reuse, and this contains all the stuff that wouldn't change from one implementation to the next. Not just Bootstrap's HTML, but some liquid too. Things like looping, dynamic slide numbering, etc. So if you want to get up and running quickly, all you need to focus on is creating an advanced find to pinpoint the records you want to show in the carousel, which I'll show you an example on screen, and then adding the logical names of the columns that you wish to output. So to get started, copy and paste the snippet from this page. So that's at francomusso.com, and it's called Creating a Bootstrap Carousel Slider Using Liquid and Fetch XML. So I'll copy the snippet, and I can paste that into any page I want to use the slider on, or if perhaps it was something that I'd be using in many places across the portal, I'd put that into a web template. But for now, I'm on the page I'm interested in, and I'm going to edit the code. So I paste in the code, and the first thing that I need is a Fetch XML query that's determining which records and which columns I want to show. So I'm going to go to the table that I'm interested in. First of all, I'm going to choose which columns I want to include. So I know I at least want the image, the description of the session, and the name. Then in the filter, what I'm interested in is all the events that have been announced in the last 3 months. Now usually I'll want a sort order as well. So let's say I'm going to do this in descending order by the date they were announced. Okay, so that's my criteria sorted. They're the columns that I want to show in the results. Knowing that I'll most likely want to make changes to this at some point, so perhaps adjust the criteria, the sort order, the columns that are included, I'm going to save a copy of that. Okay, so let's go and get the Fetch XML for our query. So I'm going to open the view selector, choose Manage and Share Views, and the one that I'm interested in is Portal Event Sessions Carousel. Open the ellipsis and choose Download Fetch XML. So luckily we don't have to write any of this, we've got a visual experience for putting all of this together. So I'll copy that and paste it in the snippet where it says paste in your Fetch XML here. Not necessarily a requirement, but what I'm going to do is split my Fetch XML over multiple lines just so I can see it more clearly. So believe it or not, we're pretty much done. So I just need to change 7 pieces of information about this, so it's very much around updating the snippet to match my table and my use case. So the first thing I'm going to do is give my query a name. So this currently says name of query. I'm going to replace all instances of that text with a meaningful name for my query. So I'm going to press Ctrl and D to select each instance of that, so press it multiple times until I can see there's no more instances of that, and perhaps I'll call this my event sessions query. Next, I want to give the carousel a unique name. The reason for this is if I ever want to include multiple carousels on the same page, each needs to have a unique name so the controls and the slides know what is their parent, who do they belong to. So I've selected the ID. Again, I'm going to hit Ctrl D multiple times so I know I've got all the instances of that. So perhaps this is my event sessions carousel. Next, I need the column names that I'm going to populate my carousel with. So I've put a placeholder in here called logical name for my image column. I'm going to copy the actual name for that from the Fetch XML. It's important that I include that underscore URL at the end. So next I'm going to go for my name column, or for your example, whatever you want as the title of your slide. I'm going to go for my description column. So for you, whatever you want as a paragraph in the caption for your slides. And then finally, I want to include a link from my slide to the individual records of that event session, so you can see, for example, the start date, the end date, the speakers, all the additional detail for that. So the placeholder I put in here has got two components. It's got a partial URL, and then it's going to be providing the GUID of the record that I want to show. So the partial URL I know is view session details. So that's just a partial URL of whatever page you want to link to, and then I replace this with the column that is the GUID for my record. So that will usually be equal to the table name and have ID at the end. And that is it. So I've provided a Fetch XML query, I've replaced the unique ID for the carousel, which is here, and I've provided the column names that I want to output. So I'm going to save that, and then let's sync and preview. Note that it won't necessarily look correct in the design canvas, so let's preview that on the portal. And here we go. It probably needs some styling to improve that, but I'm cycling through my images. I get my description, header, and a link to an individual session detail. I've got the previous and next buttons, and I can use the indicators at the bottom of the slide to navigate around. And in fact, what I'm going to do, just to show you that this can look much better quite quickly, I'm going to paste in some CSS that will style my slide, so give the captions a different look and feel. It will help the captions pop from the slide, and I'd rather have some rounded edges for this as well. For speed's sake, I've just pasted this directly into the template. I'd later put that into my CSS file, but let's see what difference that makes. I'm going to save. Again, sync and preview, and there we go. Nicer presentation to that. So I've got the indicators, the previous and next buttons, or I can just leave it and it will cycle through the slides by itself. So now let's see how to make that carousel from scratch. Make sense of what I've included in that snippet. So the prerequisites, if you want to see results quickly without hitting unnecessary roadblocks, I suggest first of all you create a table with an image column, that you populate some sample records as I have, and that you create a table permission with at least read privileges for your table. Okay, so first of all I'm going to go to the Bootstrap 3.3.6 docs and look at the sample markup for a carousel. Okay, so here we go. The component that I'm interested in, I know, is JavaScript, so I'm going to choose a JavaScript page and carousel. Knowing what the slide is made up of will help a lot when it comes to making it dynamic. So let's see what this is made up of. So the slider has a unique ID, and that's referenced in multiple places. So I can see the indicators for the carousel all reference that ID, as well as the previous and next buttons. So that unique ID is going to be important, especially if we have multiple sliders on the same page. So looking out for what's unique about the slider is important. Next, I'm interested in what is repeated within that. So that's going to give me a good indication of what constitutes one slide. So in fact, I can see that one individual slide is a div with a class of item, and also that the slide that is currently showing gets a class of active. So that's something that we'll need to take care of in Liquid. So we've got the slides, we've got the previous and next buttons. These don't change from one implementation of the slider to the next, so we can leave these alone. And then at the bottom of the slider we have these indicators. So these show us both which slide we're currently on and act as buttons to jump to another slide. Looking in the markup, this is an ordered list. Each indicator is a list item, and the way that it links to a slide is through a numeric ID starting from 0. So again, that's something that we'll need to loop through and build with Liquid, and we need to make sure that the first item has a class of active. To start with, what I'm going to do is populate the carousel with some placeholder content. So I'm going to copy that example markup and replace the snippet that I previously pasted in with that HTML. And what's not particularly helpful is in this example, you'll see there are 3 slide indicators, but only 2 example slides. So I'm going to replace that. Now I've got first item, second item, third item. So the reason that I usually go through this step first is it's useful to identify any errors in the HTML before I complicate things with Liquid and making things dynamic. One thing to be aware of with this sample markup is without an image, the height of the carousel will collapse and look a mess. So what I'm going to do is include a placeholder image for now. We can get them using an online service called pixum.photos. And what we can do is provide some dimensions. So let's say we want to have our slider 900 pixels by 500 pixels. That'll give us a random image of those dimensions. And we can provide a seed which will make sure that each time we retrieve an image, it is unique rather than repeating the same image for every slide of our carousel. So for that, I will include the word seed / a unique number, and then again my dimensions. So let's say, for example, 900 pixels by 500 pixels. Okay, so let's add that to the code. So in the source of the image, that's https pixum.photos. I want a seed 1 for my first slide and then my dimensions 900 by 500. Now in my caption, I know from another example on the Bootstrap page that'll accept a heading 3 and a paragraph, and has got some existing styling for that. So that's what I'll include in mine. And in fact what I'll do is just paste over that for my other slides. So I want that entire item div, and I'll just change a few things to make that unique for the others. So the seed of 2, my placeholder content to include the number 2, and likewise for my third slide. I want to give that a unique ID. So again, I'm going to select the ID, Control D to select all the instance of that. So I press Control D multiple times until I'm back to the beginning, and I'm going to say, for example, this is my event session slide. So let's save, sync, preview, make sure that's working how we expect it to. So save, sync, sorry, that was a Control S to save, and I've hit the sync button and preview. So all I expect to see now is that I've got 3 slides of the same dimensions and that I've got some placeholder content. So the issue that I'm experiencing for now is that every slide has a class of active. So let's resolve that. I'm going to remove that from the second 2. And what you'll see now is that only the first slide, which has a class of active, appears first, and then the slider will cycle through the rest of the content. So Control S to save, then sync and preview. Okay, so there's something like what we'd be aiming for here. Now let's look to make that dynamic. Okay, so we're going to use 3 pieces of Liquid for this. So first of all, a quick mention of which Liquid skills we'll be using and what each one brings to the table. So first of all, Fetch XML. This allows us to query Dataverse data. And as you saw earlier, we don't need to write this ourselves. We can use an advanced find, or if you're familiar with XRM toolbooks, you might prefer to use Jonas Rapp's excellent Fetch XML builder. So Fetch XML is about pinpointing the records we want to use. Next, we'll use a for loop, and this allows us to loop through each item in a collection. In our example, that will be looping through each result returned by our Fetch XML query. As well as the looping action it provides, it also gives us information about the loop and an object called for loop. And we can do things like add sequential numbering to the results, which will be useful for our navigation, and to check whether the current item is either the first or the last result. We'll use this to determine which slide gets the active class, meaning it's displayed when the carousel first loads. And finally, we'll be using if. This will allow us to perform checks on our data and to provide some fallbacks. So for example, what do we want to do if no image is provided, or what do we want to do if there is no title or description? And things we'll want to check in this example is, first, did our Fetch XML return any results? And then, is this the first item, the first result within the for loop? So for my Fetch XML, ahead of any of my content, I'm going to add an opening and a closing Fetch XML tag. I want a name so I can easily refer to this later. Okay, I've opened the tag, I want a closing tag. And in there, all that I need to do is paste in my Fetch XML from earlier. As I said, I prefer to split that out over multiple lines just to make it easier to read. It doesn't make any difference to the functionality. Okay, so first mission is accomplished. I've got a query returning all the event session records that I wish to include. Next, I don't want to do anything unless I can be sure that some results have been returned. So I'm going to use an if statement to check the size of the collection that has been returned by event session query. So to do this, I use if, then the name of my query, and any results will be stored in a collection called results.entities. And what I'm checking for is if the number of results, which I can access with the size property, is greater than 0. So only if there is one or more results do I want to do any of this. And at the end of all that, I need to close my if. Not a necessity, but just to make sure I've not broken anything so far, and so you can see the result of what we've done, I'm going to save, sync, and then preview. So far the result is much the same because my Fetch XML query has returned 3 results, and there are only 3 results in my example. So what we'll do next is have a look at the looping. So I'm going to get rid of all but one of my indicators. So all but one of the list items within this ordered list of carousel indicators. And I'm going to get rid of all but one of my items. So what I'm going to do is to loop through and output one of these divs with a class of item for every result in my Fetch XML query. So I'm going to use the same collection of what I did before. So it's my Fetch XML query .results.entities. Important that I don't include that property this time of .size. So what I want is the actual records. So I'm going to say for each result, I would then want the name of my query. So event session query .results.entities. So that's the start of what I want to repeat for every result, and here's the end. So I need to add end for. It's useful to make sure that you've not got rid of any, for example, closing tags, you've not broken anything. So what I would suggest is perhaps just click on that opening div and make sure it's closing. So I can see here's the closing div, and also the wrapper that goes around the slides. Yes, that also still opens and closes outside the loop. I'm going to check now that I've not broken anything, so that's with Control S to save. I'll sync and I'll preview. So I now see the correct number of results. I need to refine that a little bit to say, for example, that only the first slide each time gets the active class, and then we can also loop through our indicators so we get the correct number of indicators. So here you'll see the active class is hard-coded, so for every result it will receive the active class. So I now need some information about my for loop. So I'm going to say if, and then the information about my for loop is in an object called for loop. So I want to know if that is for loop.first. Is this the first item in our loop? If it is, we'll add the class of active. There's no fallback for this, there's no else, so I can close my if. So next, let's do the same for our indicators, each list item in the carousel indicators ordered list. So exactly the same, I'm going to say for each result in my event session query results entities collection, I need to end the for where I want that loop to stop. So repeat one of these list items for every result. I need to do something similar here, so only if this is the first item in my for loop, so if forloop.first, and then after the class I'll close that. That's almost for the looping logic. And for my if statements, the final step is that I need to make this number dynamic. So what I can do with that is say I want to output. So far everything we've done in Liquid is logic, meaning that we have this tag, an opening curly brace and a percentage sign. For output we use double curly braces. So I want to output the for loop index. In other words, which item number in the for loop is this? So Control S to save, I'll sync and preview, and we're almost there. So you can see my next and previous buttons are working correctly, and then I've got some content regardless of what it is. One slight issue with this is the numbering that comes back from my for loop starts from 1, and what the carousel expects, just looking back at the example, is numbering beginning with 0. So what I'm going to do is use a liquid filter, something that allows us to transform our output. In this example, I'm going to say I want to minus 1 from that for loop index. So the pipe character says that there's a filter coming. The name of my filter is minus, and any parameters come after that colon. Right, so that's the indicators fixed. Now let's make this complete by passing it some dynamic content. So the source of my image, I no longer want that placeholder image. I want my image column from Dataverse. So I'm going to say double curly braces because I want some output. This item within my for loop is called a result. So that's how I tell the portal this is the record that I'm interested in from this collection. So I'm going to say result dot and then the name of the column that I'm interested in. I'm going to do the same for my heading 3 and for my paragraph. So for my paragraph I'm going to get the name column for my table, and for the paragraph I want the description. Again, double curly braces because I want some actual output rather than logic. Result to tell the portal this is the record that I care about, this item in my collection of results. And then I also want a hyperlink from this slide to that actual detail of that session. So before I publish this video, I'll add that to the placeholder, but as an example of how we created this, I want an anchor tag where the href, the destination for that link, is / the partial URL for my page, so view event session / and then knowing how these single pages work, like for example when you open a form from a list, we have $ID equals, and then we want a GUID, the unique identifier for that session in my example. So now that's going to be result dot, and then I want the GUID for this record. As I mentioned before, that is usually going to be the logical name for your table and then ID at the end. So for example, if you were to open a contact, that would be result.contact ID. I want this to be styled like a button, so I'm going to give it some classes that I know style it like a button in the portal. So btn for button and btn-primary to give it the styling for a primary button. I want some text for my hyperlink, so perhaps just say view details, and then all is good. I'm going to save, sync, preview. Almost there. The final step is to say I don't want just the thumbnail of this image, I want the full size image. So what I do with that is within my image source, so outside of my curly braces, I'm going to say I want full with a capital F equals true. So our final save sync preview, and there we go, that's all now working with our full size images. And if I was to hover over one of these buttons, I can see that it's included the GUID of that record, so I can go and view that event should I wish to. So now I can click the View Details button. If I hover over that in my status bar, you can see that that's going to take me to the View Event Session page and past the GUID of the record. So if I click that, it takes me to a rather ugly page, but there's an example of that functionality, that I can go from some headline details about a record to viewing the entire thing. Thanks very much for watching.